So, the beginning expeditions to California, I mean, substantially, they go pretty late. There are early ones like Cabrillo's expedition, and that is mid 16th century, but nothing really comes from that. I mean, there's more of just kind of navigating the coast. It really is more of a 17th century, 18th century ordeal where there's this push to go north and set up these missions. So if you think about it, Spain involvement in California is way later than what they've already done, like in present day Mexico, randomly taking over the Aztec Empire and all that, and maybe to some extent having that home base, in Mexico, Mexico City, not Mexico City, helped them to be able to do that there. Um, Unlike this kind of slow process to go north um, and into California. I mean, and that's kind of the case across the American Southwest, honestly. So, I mean, you think of like Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, for example. Um, it's a similar story. The big push of Spanish California is the mission system. And if you've been out here, if you're born and raised in California, you had to probably at one point did a missions project or even um, visited one of the missions, and they're still around. You could do that. Some local ones. But that one was set up kind of with sword and saint kind of storyline, right? So I mean, it was something that is the church goes along with soldiers, and in a lot of ways, you have the it's particularly the Jesuits very very forceful in putting up these missions, particularly the figure of Junipero Serra, which again, this is 18th century expedition. So think about the timing. You say 18th century in U.S. history, we're talking about American Revolution time period. So I mean, this is how late of the nature of what we're talking about. Now, the Jesuits were the big initial push via the missions, and in some ways, um, they, in general, were better about um, connecting with indigenous peoples, and this is kind of a story globally for the Jesuits, at least. The Franciscan Serra did not have as much of um, as big as an understanding in a sense of respecting indigenous cultures. And so, even though he's just actually made a saint by Pope Francis the first, it is seen as controversial. The more you go into the history, it does seem like once the neophytes were in the missions, they were kind of forced to stay as laborers. And the way it oftentimes is told is that the missions were a refuge, especially with some of these inter tribal battles between the different groups. But in some case, these figures are um, forced to stay at the missions. Especially as I mentioned, these expeditions go with not just the cross, but also with the sword and the rifle. So um, and closing up the missions and not allowing people the autonomy, the freedom to move around. The crown itself has very little. The crown of Spain has very little oversight in California and in the various missions that are built up um, across the state. So, in general, Spain's um, connection to California is very, very tenuous, um, or tentative, I should say. Um, and even as we're going to see, Mexico's connection to the state is somewhat not as deep rooted as you might think. Okay, so um, Mexico will have independence in the 1820s. This is partly because of the Napoleonic Wars, and the French, these European wars that are going on, and Spain kind of being under control of Napoleon. And so again, a little oversight over what's going on in the Americas, and so this leads to Mexico pushing for independence. Between 1810 and about the mid 1820s, and then following that, you get this kind of push for secularization, and that's what happens to the mission territories. So instead of so if Spain's connection to California are the missions, Mexico's connection to California are the rancheros. So these are these big ranches where you have people working on it. And it's almost like this one big, big, but yet mini society under this ranch head. And so this is, what gets established again in California in particular. And you can still kind of visit these territories. You see like some of the stuff left over from these ranches, and the way the houses were made, and the servants, particularly indigenous people, lived in these places. Um, Probably the best example is Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo of Monterrey, and you can look at his years. He lives a long time, but he has his property shrinks over time. That's a different story. There are uprisings. So I did mention a lot of the indigenous people, as the like tribal groups are starting to die off, and people are being kind of sucked up into the missions, or dying off in warfare and disease. You have various groups um, who break off. You have the Yokut Tribalates revolt in 1829. This is led by a guy named Stanislao, and he's famous for basically rallying groups to revolt. Massive amount of theft of the missions are happening, and this then leads to the missions resorting to utilize soldiers way more often than not. And so again, this you can kind of see the situation's getting out of hand. Um, um, so eventually, this then leads into a number of atrocities against Native American groups as like a response to some of these uprisings. Um, and as this happens, more people escape and are roaming, and kind of almost going into a sense of like guerrilla warfare. Eventually, a massive amount of troop, um, and the technology that the Mexican troop is using, is going to force the Native Americans to eventually want to return um, to these ranches, and um, all is kind of forgiven at that point. Again, very little oversight from Mexico in this particular story. But it also does get to the point where you're starting to see more and more Native Americans dying, because now California is becoming more and more populated. I guess malaria really does a number on tribes, because you're getting Canadian trappers going in. But this is kind of like the next swing of the story, where more and more U.S. Americans are starting to go there. The very first like concrete visit by Americans are the so-called mountain men. They're moving out and walking across this terrain. Remember, this is post Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark expedition. So now adventurous men from the East Coast are going out and scouting and basically seeking adventure, moving across the Midwest to the far West, and so they are mapping this route, and this will be the maps that are going to be used by the pioneers. Are going to start to move towards California. And that's going to be a big carrot on the stick, or they're going to try to fashion some carrot on the stick, I should say, because California, for a long time, outside of the gold rush, California's going to have a hard time trying to entice people on the East Coast to actually go there. Like there's nothing there in their mind. Um, so it's the mountain men. They're going to be the first to really start to do this. Jedediah Strong Smith, who only lives to 1831, he is the first to lead a party of U.S. Americans overland to California. So he's famous for that, and he's attached to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Eventually, John Sutter, he's the one who establishes Fort Sutter, which is going to be important. And he actually gets this from the Russians, and Russians are already there. Can you remember? One of the things that's kind of elusive about California history is it is connected to the Pacific Ocean, and we don't really think about that because when we study U.S. history, we're oftentimes always focused on the Atlantic and Europe, and Boston and New York and Washington, right? So that's our focus in U.S. history is often there, and we don't think like, okay, when you're thinking about the West Coast, Asia is right there. So that means Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, um, Hawaii, and then Russia as well. And so some of the earliest settlers from Asia and particularly Russia in the U.S. Comes here, go to the West Coast, and Russia, as Starr talks a little bit about, has a presence in trade. So there is trade happening, and there is a kind of establishment happening, and in some ways Mexico is okay with this, right? It's kind of, again, we tend to focus on Texas for some reason, even in U.S. history, and we know Texas was not heavily populated with Spanish settlers, and then even Mexican settlers. Once that transition happened, wasn't really settled with Mexican settlers. And so, Mexico was more than willing to allow U.S. Americans again to populate Texas. I mean, there was some, things they're supposed to follow, but as you know in history, doesn't mean that they did. And so before they realize it, there's more and more U.S. Americans flowing into these Mexican territories. And if you think about the years, the Mexican-American War is in 1848 and 1846 to 1848. So that is going to be a big, big turning point for California and the rest of the Southwest.